Immigrant women as well have endured a long history of sexual exploitation in the U.S. Excuse me. For instance, racially discriminatory employment laws forced thousands of Chinese immigrant women into prostitution. To supplement their meager incomes, impoverished Chinese families often sold their daughters into prostitution. Other women were lured to the U.S. with the promise of a stable marriage or job, only to find themselves trapped in the sex trade. By 1860, almost a quarter of the Chinese in San Francisco, all female, were employed in prostitution. Karen Warren argues that patriarchal society is a dysfunctional system that mirrors a dysfunctional nuclear family. That is, severe abuse in the family continues because the family members learn to regard it as normal. A victim of abuse may come to see that her abuse is not normal when she is in contact with less abusive families. Similarly, Warren argues, patriarchal society is a dysfunctional system based on domination and violence. Quote, dysfunctional systems are often maintained through systemic denial, a failure or inability to see the reality of a situation. This denial need not be conscious, intentional, or malicious. It only needs to be pervasive to be effective. End quote. At the time of Columbus's exploits, European society was a dysfunctional system, racked by mass poverty, disease, religious oppression, war, and institutionalized violence. For example, in the Inquisition, hundreds of thousands of Jewish people were slaughtered and their confiscated property was used to fund Columbus's voyages. David Stannard writes, quote, violence, of course, was everywhere. In Milan in 1476, a man was torn to pieces by an enraged mob, and his dismembered limbs were eaten by his tormentors. In Paris and Lyon, Huguenots were killed and butchered, and their various body parts were sold openly in the streets. Other eruptions of bizarre torture, murder, and ritual cannibalism were not uncommon. End quote. Furthermore, European societies were thoroughly misogynistic. The Christian patriarchy which structured European society was inherently violent, as it has been thoroughly documented. For example, because English women were not allowed to express political opinions, a woman who spoke out against taxation in 1664 was condemned to having her tongue nailed to a tree near a highway, with paper fastened to her back detailing her offense. Hatred for women was most fully manifested in the witch hunts. In some English towns, as many as a third of the population were accused of witchcraft. The women targeted for destruction were those most independent from patriarchal authority, single women, widows, and healers. The more peaceful and egalitarian nature of native societies did not escape the notice of the colonizers. In the colonial period, it was a scandal in the colonies that a number of white people chose to live among Indian people, while virtually no Indians voluntarily chose to live among the colonists. Wonder why. According to J. Hector St. John de Courcebois, the 18th century author of Letters from an American Farmer, quote, thousands of Europeans are Indians, and we have no example of even one of these aborigines having from choice become Europeans. End quote. Colonists also noted that native peoples rarely committed sexual violence against white prisoners, unlike the colonists. Brigadier General James Clinton of the Continental Army said to his soldiers as they were sent off to destroy the Iroquois nation in 1779, quote, bad as the savages are, they never violate the chastity of any woman, their prisoners, end quote. William Epes, a 19th century Pecot, asked, quote, where, in the records of Indian barbarity, can we point to a violated female, end quote. Shahut and Stem argued the real purpose behind colonial terror, quote, was not to enforce the indigenes to become Europeans, but to keep Europeans from becoming indigenes, end quote. In contrast to the deeply patriarchal nature of European societies, prior to colonization, Indian societies for the most part were not male-dominated. Women served as spiritual, political, and military leaders, and many societies were matrilineal. Although there existed a division of labor between women and men, women's labor and men's labor was accorded similar status. As women and men lived in balance, native societies were consequently much less authoritarian than their European counterparts. Paul Lejeune, a Jesuit priest, remarked in the 17th century, quote, native peoples imagine that they ought to, by right of birth, enjoy the liberty of wild-ass colts, rendering no homage to anyone whatsoever except when they like. All the authority of their chief is in his tongue's end, for he is powerful insofar as he is eloquent, and even if he kills himself talking and haranguing, he will not be obeyed unless he pleases the savages. End quote. Furthermore, 70% of tribes did not practice war at all. For those who did engage in war, the intent was generally not to annihilate the enemy, but to accrue honor through bravery. One accrued more honor by getting close enough to an enemy to touch him and leave him alive than by killing him. Tom Holm writes, quote, traditional Indian warfare had much in common with Euro-American contact sports like football, boxing, and hockey than with wars fought in the European manner. This is of course not to say that nobody was ever killed. They were, just as they are in modern contact sports, but the point of the exercise was not, as a rule, purposefully lethal." End quote. Of course, in discussing these trends, it is important not to overgeneralize or give the impression that Native communities were utopian prior to colonization. Certainly, gender violence occurred prior to colonization. Nevertheless, both oral and written records often note its relative rarity as well as the severity of the punishment for perpetrators of violence. This record of punishment for sexual assault among the Kiowas serves as an illustration. Quote, "The Kiowas inflicted such embarrassment and ridicule on a criminal that he reportedly soon died. The man was a chronic rapist who was finally taught the error of his ways by the woman. They laid an ambush and baited the trap with a beautiful young girl. When he took the bait, they suddenly appeared and overpowered him. As others held him helpless on the ground, each woman in turn raised her skirts and sat on his face. The experience was not in itself fatal, but the loss of status stemming from the derision it inspired was. The possibility of such drastic punishment was perhaps more chastening in its effect than the threat of the electric chair in more sophisticated societies." End quote. Similar practices existed among the Anishinaabe. Quote, "Wife battering, as we have seen, was neither accepted nor tolerated among the Anishinaabe people until after the freedom to live Ojibwe was subdued. Wife battering emerged simultaneously with the disintegration of Ojibwe ways of life and the beginning use of alcohol. The behavior of the Ojibwe people under the influence of alcohol is often totally contrary to Anishinaabe values. It is especially contrary to the self-discipline previously necessary to the development of Ojibwe character. There is no single philosophy among the people in today's society regarding the social illness of wife battering. Many have forgotten or did not receive the teaching of the social laws surrounding it. In the old Ojibwe society itself was responsible for what took place within it. Today that is not so. What is the evidence of that statement? The harmful, destructive, traumatic cycle of domestic violence that is befalling the Anishinaabe children of the nation. Today we have lost a lot of the traditions, values, ways of life, laws, language, teaching of the elders, respect, humility as our people, because of the European mentality we have accepted. For our people to survive as a nation, together we must turn back the pages of time. We must face reality, do an evaluation of ourselves as a people, why we were why we were created to live in harmony with one another as Anishinaabe people and to live in harmony with the Creator's creation." End quote. European women were often surprised to find that, even in war, they went unmolested by their Indian captors. Mary Rowlandson said of her experience, quote, "I have been in the midst of roaring lions and savage bears that feared neither God nor man nor the devil, and yet not one of them ever offered the least abuse of unchastity to me in word or action." End quote. Between 1675 and 1763, almost 40% of women who were taken captive by Native people in New England chose to remain with their captors. In 1899, an editorial signed by Mrs. Teal appeared in the Syracuse Herald Journal discussing the status of women in Iroquois society. Quote, "They had one custom the white men are not ready even yet to accept. The women of the Iroquois had a public and influential position. They had a council of their own, which had the initiative in the discussion, subjects presented by them being settled in the councils of the chiefs and elders. In this latter council, the women had an orator of their own, often of their own sex, to present and speak for them. There are sometimes female chiefs. The wife owned all the property. The family was heard. Descent was counted through the mother." End quote. In response to her editorial, a man who signed himself as student replied, quote, "Women among the Iroquois, Mrs. Teal says, had a council of their own and orators and chiefs. Why does she not add what follows an explanation of why such deference was paid to women, that, in the torture of prisoners, women were thought more skillful and subtle than the men, and the men of the Inquisition were outdone in the refinement of cruelty practiced upon their victims by these savages. It is true also that succession was through women, not the men in Iroquois tribes, but the explanation is that it was generally a difficult guess to tell the fatherhood of children. The Indian maiden never learned to blush. The Indians, about whom so much rhetoric has been wasted, were a savage, merciless lot who would never have developed themselves nearer to civilization than they were found by missionaries and traders. Their love was to butcher and burn, to roast their victims and eat them, to lie and rob, to live in filth, men, women, children, dogs, and fleas crowded together." End quote. Sounds a lot like men on MRA forums today. Thus, the demonization of Native women can be seen as a strategy of white men to maintain control over white women. This demonization was exemplified by the captivity narratives, which